The morning mist clung with obstinate persistence to the narrow streets of Haverley, softening the outlines of the parish church and muting the colours of its surrounding cottages. Inspector Purbright, hat tipped at a conservative angle, surveyed the scene with quiet deliberation, noting the subtle wear on the flagstones that bespoke a century of diligent, if occasionally distracted, congregation. The rector, Mr. Alistair Bellamy, greeted him with that precise blend of cordiality and veiled anxiety peculiar to those whose conscience, while untroubled, has been mildly interrogated by rumour. "Inspector," he said, adjusting the neat fold of his waistcoat, "there has been, I hesitate to admit, a matter of some minor irregularity in the sacristy." Purbright inclined his head. "Minor, you say?" His tone carried neither incredulity nor impatience, merely the patient interest of one accustomed to measuring the significance of minor events. "Yes," Bellamy replied, eyes flicking to the corner where the sunlight struggled to pierce the fogged windows. "A note, left, I believe, under the parish notice board. Anonymous, naturally. It warns of, well, unwelcome behaviours during service." He paused as if the words themselves might betray more than they should. The inspector took the slip of paper, noting at once the delicate lavender scent that lingered faintly, the neat, almost preternatural handwriting, and the unusual flourish of the final Y. Such minutiae, he thought, were frequently more revealing than any outburst of indignation or confession. He observed the flower-arranging committee arriving for their morning rehearsal, their eyes flicking furtively at the church door, as if aware that something had been disturbed but uncertain of the implications. Inside, the sacristy bore the expected order of ceremonial precision, interrupted only by a displaced hymnal and a missing pew cushion. Purbright knelt to examine the floor, noting the slight irregularity in dust accumulation near the altar rail. "No forced entry," he murmured to himself, his tone low enough to escape casual detection, though the rector straightened instinctively, as if the very act of observation might implicate him. Outside, villagers exchanged over-polished greetings, each phrase loaded with the invisible weight of social expectation. Mrs. Lowther, the parish newsletter editor, offered a strained smile. "Inspector, I trust the note will not disrupt the regular proceedings," she inquired, her voice syrupy with propriety, yet brittle with concealed curiosity. Purbright inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Disruption is rarely immediate, Mrs. Lowther. One finds that suspicion, once seeded, flourishes quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the minds of the observant." The florist, arriving with early deliveries for the morning service, added another layer of quiet intrigue. She apologized for the intrusion. Although it was obvious her apology encompassed more than mere trespass, it hinted at an awareness of unspoken rivalries. Purbright, noting the subtle tremor in her hands as she arranged the posies, catalogued her nervousness for future reference. In the vestry, Miss Tripp, the rector's secretary, fussed with the ledger, her movements precise yet slightly hurried. A bead of sweat gathered on her brow, or perhaps it was the effect of the stifling incense. Either way, it spoke of unease. Purbright observed her carefully, mindful that human behavior rarely reveals itself in grand gestures. The slightest hesitation, a glance too quickly averted, a mislaid page, all carried import. The note, lavender-scented and neatly folded, had been innocuous in content, yet its existence suggested a mind attuned to observation, one capable of minor interventions that cumulatively might yield considerable disruption. Purbright's thoughts drifted toward the social lattice of Haverley, committees, letter-writing, the ever-watchful newsletter. Each was a vector through which reputation and disapproval travelled, often with subtle cruelty and occasional comic ineptitude. In the early afternoon, he accompanied the rector on a tour of the churchyard, ostensibly to inspect the tombstones, though in truth the exercise allowed him to observe the parishioners' interaction with their sacred space. There was Mrs. Abernathy, adjusting her hat as she moved gingerly past the new memorial, and Mr. Finch, who lingered too long by the vestry window, pretending interest in the gravestones while casting discreet glances toward the sacristy door. Purbright's notebook, never opened but perpetually in mental use, recorded these small peculiarities: a frown, a tilt of the head, a careful avoidance of direct eye contact. By the time the sun had climbed above the fog, a subtle tension had woven itself into the parish atmosphere. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No scandal had erupted. And yet the inspector felt the pulse of quiet apprehension, the delicate anxiety of reputations threatened by unspecified knowledge. It was, he reflected, in these fragile crevices between civility and curiosity that Haverley's true character revealed itself. As he prepared to leave, a last observation presented itself. The rector's ledger lay slightly ajar on the desk, a page marked with an ink smudge that did not match the day's entries. It was trivial, almost laughably so, yet Purbright noted it with the same careful attention he afforded the faint scent of lavender or the anxious twitch of a secretary's hand. The church, it seemed, had already begun to whisper its secrets, quietly, politely, and with deliberate caution. And somewhere in the margin of that neat, anonymous note, the first faint suggestion of a deliberate observer had been left, unseen by all but the patient mind of Inspector Purbright. The chapter concluded on this quiet note of possibility, a whisper of intent, a question that had yet to be fully formed. Inspector Purbright accepted the rector's invitation to afternoon tea, an event that promised civility, caution, and the subtle revelations peculiar to Haverley's social fabric. Mr. Alistair Bellamy received him with all the calm assurance of a man who had rehearsed hospitality meticulously, yet whose eyes betrayed a flicker of unease the moment the door closed. "Do sit, Inspector. I trust the morning has treated you gently?" The question, innocuous as it seemed, carried the customary weight of parish politeness, an inquiry that demanded answer, yet revealed more in what it concealed. Tea was served with the precise choreography of low, NG practiced ritual. Miss Tripp, the rector's secretary, maneuvered the silver teapot with care that bordered on anxious. A slight tremor in her wrist betrayed a nervousness that she sought to disguise beneath the rigid elegance of her gloves. Purbright observed discreetly, noting the faint furrow in her brow, the almost imperceptible hesitation in her paw. Small gestures, after all, often revealed more than direct speech, particularly in communities where forthrightness carried the risk of offense. "Letters," said Bellamy, pouring cream with exactitude, "arrive in abundance of late, some, I fear, more pointed than polite." He glanced toward the secretary, who coughed lightly before straightening, as if the mere mention of correspondence carried a latent threat. Purbright inclined his head slightly. In Haverley, even routine communication was freighted with potential intrigue. The rector's voice, polite and composed, masked awareness of a minor scandal, or at least the anticipation of one. Miss Tripp ventured a comment on the parish newsletter, observing that certain entries might invite attention where none is desired. Her phrasing suggested that the attention in question was not accidental, it was deliberately drawn, the product of deliberate observation and careful, quiet intervention. Purbright noted her choice of words with patient interest. In such a village, insinuation was more potent than accusation, and subtlety often served as the most effective weapon. The conversation drifted toward the flower arranging committee, a subject seemingly banal yet laden with implications. The rector described a recent dispute over the placement of posies near the altar, offering each detail with an almost surgical precision. "It is astonishing," Bellamy remarked, "how a disagreement over a single bloom can fracture polite society for weeks." Purbright made a mental note. Horticultural quarrels, as trivial as they might appear, often reveal deeper allegiances, resentments, or attempts to assert social dominance. In the adjoining drawing room, the inspector's attention fell upon a ledger, slightly ajar on a side table, its pages marked with faint indentations. He examined them with the care of one deciphering a text written in half-concealed code. The markings were neither chaotic nor hurried. They were deliberate, methodical, and, in their quiet precision, spoke to a mind attentive to observation, subtle manipulation, and perhaps the gentle orchestration of reputational anxiety. A knock at the door introduced the florist arriving to deliver early preparations for Sunday's service. She apologized with a careful humility, her voice tempered by the village's strict conventions of politeness. Yet her eyes flicked toward Miss Tripp, then the inspector, as if acknowledging some unspoken hierarchy of knowledge. Purbright catalogued her behavior, the way she angled her body, the cautious lowering of her gaze, the slight pause before answering questions. Each movement, while seemingly insignificant, carried layers of intention, deference, and perhaps fear of social reprisal. Bellamy, aware of the inspector's scrutiny, attempted a diversion by remarking on the recent organ repair. "It functions admirably," he said, though the assistant organist exhibits a tendency to linger over certain passages. The phrasing was precise, the tone genial, yet it suggested subtle criticism. Purbright recognized the familiar pattern, polite observation serving as a vehicle for censure, the moral framework of the parish codified into careful speech. T concluded without overt revelation, yet the room was dense with minor signals, social cues, and understated tensions. Miss Tripp's hands, previously trembling, now rested with careful stillness upon her lap. Why? Yet her eyes betrayed lingering apprehension. The florist adjusted her gloves, casting a glance toward the ledger. Even the rector, serene in demeanor, carried the faintest shadow of preoccupation across his forehead. As Purbright prepared to depart, he noted a minor anomaly. The sugar tongs, ordinarily positioned equidistant between cups, had been shifted slightly toward the rector's side, an almost imperceptible gesture of territorial assertion or habitual dominance. Trivial, perhaps, yet in Haverley, such subtleties were rarely accidental. The inspector made a mental note of the displacement, filing it alongside the lavender-scented note from the prior morning, the misaligned pew cushion, and the displaced hymnal. Stepping into the muted sunlight of the early afternoon, Purbright sensed the village's pulse with quiet satisfaction. No scandal had erupted, no confrontation had occurred. Yet every detail, from the tremor in a secretary's hand to the adjusted sugar tongs, suggested the subtle choreography of social tension, reputational anxiety, and polite deception. He walked slowly, aware that Haverley's true mysteries were never sudden or violent. They emerged gradually, through observation, inference, and the careful study of minor, often overlooked gestures. By the time he reached the edge of the churchyard, a faint sound of deliberate movement drew his attention. Somewhere within the rectory, a door had closed softly, leaving the faintest echo in the corridor. It was trivial, almost dismissible, yet it suggested another observer at work, someone attentive to routine, someone careful to remain unseen. Purbright paused, eyes narrowing slightly, the smallest hint of a smile at the subtlety of village intrigue. The chapter concluded not with revelation, but with quiet anticipation, a minor disturbance, a hint of intent, and the knowledge that observation alone will guide the next step of the investigation. The parish council convened in the modest committee room at precisely 2 o'clock, chairs arranged with meticulous attention to symmetry, as if order itself could suppress discord. Inspector Purbright, seated near the far window, observed the participants with quiet patience. Miss Darling, chair of the council, presided over the meeting with the delicate authority of one accustomed to minor tyrannies masked as civic responsibility. "Gentlemen, ladies," she began, her voice clipped yet courteous, "we are gathered to consider matters of some importance, though perhaps not urgency." Her phrasing suggested that triviality could be rendered consequential by careful attention, or that minor grievances might be magnified by inattentive management. The first agenda item concerned the recent charity fund collection. Mr. Finch, a man whose civility was only equalled by his penchant for measured criticism, spoke at length on the allocation of proceeds. His sentences were long, ornate, and encumbered with apologies, the linguistic equivalent of protective gloves, shielding blunt opinion with layers of civility. Purbright noted the faint arch of his eyebrows when he mentioned the flower arranging committee, a subtle indication that this seemingly peripheral matter might carry deeper significance. Miss Darling responded with characteristic precision. "I understand Mr. Finch's concern, yet, as you will recall from prior discussions, our decisions must reflect both propriety and the broader social harmony of the parish." Her phrasing was careful. Social harmony, she implied, might occasionally require suppression of minor truths. Purbright, familiar with such euphemistic constructions, recorded the statement mentally, a polite mask for implicit judgment. The rector contributed little beyond measured assent, though a slight twitch in his right hand hinted at internal unease. He referenced the bell ringer's attendance, a subject apparently banal, yet Purbright recognized the potential for latent conflict. Attendance, after all, was as much a social indicator as it was functional. Who arrived, who lingered, and who abstained spoke volumes about allegiance, ambition, and resentment. Mrs. Abernathy, noted for her impeccable manners and tenacious memory, raised a concern regarding the choir's rehearsal schedule. Her phrasing was hedged with apologies. "I hesitate, but it may be prudent to consider whether rehearsals interfere unduly with other parish duties." Purbright observed the council's subtle shift in posture. Eyebrows lifted, lips pursed, glances exchanged, the silent dance of polite suspicion. Mrs. Abernathy's cautionary tone implied not a genuine logistical issue, but an awareness of latent tensions, the undercurrent of minor grievances that animated so much of Haverley life. When the matter of the misplaced hymnals was broached, Miss Tripp's eyes flickered toward the ledger at the side of the room. Her response was careful, measured. It is entirely possible they were inadvertently relocated. She emphasized inadvertence, though the tilt of her head and the faint contraction of her mouth suggested she knew more than she admitted. Purbright noted these nuances with deliberate attention. In such villages, the small signs often carried greater weight than any confession. The discussion drifted, inevitably, toward the recent minor dispute over flower placement near the altar. Mr. Finch returned to the topic with thinly veiled irritation, while the rector offered mild interjections to preserve harmony. Miss Darling, sensing the growing tension, employed a subtle rhetorical device. She elevated the minor disagreement into a reflection on civic responsibility and collective conscience, by framing the quarrel. In moral terms, she preserved decorum while ensuring that each participant recognized the implicit hierarchy of authority. Throughout the meeting, Purbright catalogued a constellation of minor gestures, a cough that masked impatience, a hand brushing against a ledger in hesitant concealment, a fleeting glance toward the window as if measuring the passage of time or the vigilance of neighbors. Each movement, while seemingly trivial, contributed to a composite picture of a community navigating the delicate balance between civility and resentment. In Haverley, appearances were meticulously curated, yet beneath the surface lay a network of minor alliances, grudges, and self-protective deceptions. As the meeting adjourned, the inspector lingered, observing the dispersal with a gentle detachment. Mrs. Abernathy paused at the door, casting a glance toward Miss Tripp that was brief yet pregnant with meaning, acknowledgement, warning, or perhaps subtle complicity. The rector adjusted his glasses with deliberate care, eyes briefly meeting Purbright's in what might have been invitation or caution. Purbright's attention settled on the ledger, now left open on the committee table. The previous entries revealed nothing overtly suspicious, yet a faint indentation along the margin suggested recent writing, hurried or concealed. He made a silent note of this, aware that in Haverley, the minutiae of paper, handwriting, and posture often provided more reliable guidance than any overt declaration. As he departed the committee room, the faint echo of a chair scraped against the wooden floor caught his attention. Trivial, almost imperceptible, yet it marked the departure of one whose mind lingered over undisclosed knowledge. The chapter concluded with no overt revelation, but the lingering signs, the ledger, the glance between Mrs. Abernathy and Miss Tripp, the quiet rearrangement of fern. Itcher hinted at subtle undercurrents of deception, observation, and the slow unfolding of reputational intrigue. In Haverley, the most potent revelations were rarely shouted. They were whispered, hinted, or merely implied. And for Inspector Purbright, it was precisely these whispers, these minute dissonances in otherwise impeccable manners, that would guide the patient unraveling of the parish's quiet mysteries. The afternoon sun fell obliquely through the narrow windows of the rectory study, casting long, pale rectangles of light across the floorboards and lending an air of deliberate quiet to the room. Inspector Purbright stood near the desk, carefully examining a bundle of letters, their envelopes sealed with an understated elegance and scented faintly with lavender. Such a delicate addition, he noted, might suggest an author intent on refinement rather than threat, but in Haverley, refinement often concealed intention, and scent could serve as both signal and distraction. Miss Tripp hovered near the doorway, hands folded, her posture impeccable yet rigid. She offered no comment, only a faint cough now and then, as if punctuating the silence with polite acknowledgement. Purbright's eyes followed her subtle movements, the slight shifting of weight from one foot to the other, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw when he picked up the first envelope. It was, he reflected, the very stillness that often betrayed knowledge or hesitation. The rector entered with his habitual calm, his gait measured and eyes trained more on the letters than on Purbright. "I believe, Inspector," he said carefully, "that these arrived over the past fortnight. Nothing, at least nothing overtly alarming. Merely correspondence, if one can ever say that of letters in Haverley." His phrasing, polite yet wry, betrayed a familiar awareness. In such a village, mere words could carry subtle authority or gentle censure. Purbright opened the first letter with deliberate care. The handwriting was neat, loops rounded and regular, yet the spacing suggested the hand of someone accustomed to precision, possibly someone eager to maintain appearances while observing the minutiae of others' lives. Each word was chosen with care, the tone polite, formal, yet carrying an undercurrent of observation. He placed the letter beside its companions, noting how the lavender had penetrated the paper unevenly, suggesting the author lingered over each envelope in a ritual of composition. Miss Tripp approached the desk, ostensibly to straighten the scattered papers, yet her eyes were drawn toward Purbright's careful scrutiny. She offered a faint smile, the sort of expression that promised cooperation while withholding full disclosure. Purbright observed as one studies a small, intricate mechanism, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers brushed the desk, the measured hesitation before she spoke. "Some of these," she said softly, "were delivered in person. Others, left upon the doorstep, though always before service. It seemed preferable to avoid attention." The inspector inclined his head, noting the subtext. The pattern of delivery implied forethought, discretion, and awareness of parish routines. He imagined the movements, someone navigating the quiet streets, noting the positions of neighbors, the timing of bell ringers, the comings and goings of the committees. The letters themselves, in their gentle fragrance, might serve as innocuous social probes, intended to gauge reaction, test loyalty, or influence perception. Bellamy, standing behind the desk, gestured toward the open ledger. "I confess, Inspector, I did not scrutinize each letter's contents until prompted. One assumes the best, yet—" His voice trailed into a courteous murmur, implying concern without specifying its precise nature. Purbright recognized the familiar dance, civility as both shield and mirror, revealing anxieties without explicit admission. A soft rustle from the windowsill drew attention. Outside, the flower arranging committee passed, moving with the deliberate care of those accustomed to observation, glances cast at the rectory door as if evaluating both timing and effect. Purbright made a mental note. In Haverley, the line between vigilance and intrusion was slender, and often those most concerned with propriety were also the most invested in others' reputations. He returned to the letters, now reading one aloud to himself. Tone even, eyes alert to nuance, phrases carefully qualified, apologies for presumed impertinence, and allusions to minor deviations from decorum during recent services. There was no accusation, yet every word suggested scrutiny, judgment, and social calibration. One phrase in particular hinted at the vestry's recent disturbance, an innocent mention of disarray framed as observation rather than reproach. Purbright noted it mentally, the first subtle evidence of deliberate oversight rather than accident. Miss Tripp moved closer again, holding a tray of tea with an almost imperceptible tremor. "I thought it might assist, Inspector," she said softly, placing the cups with precise symmetry. Even in her service, he observed, the careful modulation of posture, tone, and gesture conveyed attention to decorum while hinting at concealed tension. The smallest lapses, a misaligned saucer, a slight overspill of tea, would in another context be trivial. Here they suggested consciousness of minute observation and the anxiety of being scrutinized. Purbright closed the letters gently and placed them in a neat stack. The lavender's fragrance lingered in the air, a faint reminder of the careful orchestration at work. His gaze rested on the ledger, on Miss Tripp, on the faint pattern of glances from the rector. Each movement, each hesitation, each subtle choice of phrase carried significance. The chapter concluded with a minor yet deliberate anomaly, a smudge of ink at the bottom margin of one envelope. Faint but discernible, suggesting hurried writing or a miscalculation in secrecy. Trivial to the casual observer perhaps, yet for Purbright, it marked the presence of an active, watchful hand within the parish, someone attuned to subtle social manipulation, keen to observe and influence, yet careful not to overstep. In Haverley, the smallest deviation from neatness could hint at intent, and so, as the inspector left the study, he carried with him the awareness that the letters were not merely correspondence. They were instruments of quiet scrutiny, heralding the slow, deliberate unfolding of the parish's latent intrigues. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall just as the choir was assembling for their mid-afternoon rehearsal. The room, elongated and modestly furnished, carried the faint scent of wax polish and old hymnals. Choir members greeted one another with polite nods, yet their eyes flicked occasionally toward the inspector, as if measuring his presence against customary proprieties. He observed the choreography of civility, slight inclinations of the head, careful modulation of tone, and the delicate placement of music folders to suggest attentiveness while concealing minor rivalries. Miss Abernathy, seated near the organ, adjusted her gloves with meticulous care. Her movements, though understated, betrayed a tension barely concealed beneath her calm exterior. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "we have a new assistant organist. I trust you will find his work adequate." The qualifier, seemingly innocent, suggested a subtle critique of both musical performance and, perhaps, social awareness. Purbright noted the inflection without comment, allowing the remark to float in the ambient quiet, its implications lingering unspoken. The organist, a young man recently introduced to the parish, attempted a passage with precise attention to timing, though a slight hesitation betrayed his awareness of observation. Purbright catalogued each nuance, the bend of a wrist, the timing of a breath, the careful placement of a foot upon the pedal. In Haverley, the performance of duty, musical or otherwise, often concealed layers of social positioning. Even a minor misstep might be noted, discussed in whispered conjecture, and subtly leveraged to assert hierarchy. The soprano section, seated at the far end of the room, murmured in near imperceptible tones about the placement of sheet music and the absence of particular hymnals. Their speech was polite yet suggestive, small discrepancies noted with a blend of concern and judgment. Purbright detected the tension immediately. It was not mere forgetfulness, but a careful observation designed to illuminate perceived lapses in responsibility or propriety. He made a mental note of the patterns, timing of delivery, choice of words, glances exchanged, all minute instruments of social calibration. A soft cough drew the inspector's attention to the tenor section, where Mr. Finch, ever conscientious, adjusted the alignment of folders and chairs. The gesture, outwardly trivial, carried a subtle implication: orderliness as moral signifier, neatness as demonstration of diligence. Purbright smiled inwardly. In Haverley, minutiae were never trivial. One observed the patterns, the hesitations, the misplaced page or untended hymn book, and the village revealed its latent hierarchies and resentments. Miss Tripp appeared near the doorway, ostensibly to distribute additional copies of the evening's musical selections. Her presence, however, carried the weight of silent observation. Purbright noted the slight narrowing of her eyes as she passed the organist, the discreet folding of her hands before retreating. Every gesture was calculated, polite yet scrutinizing, and every participant in the room registered her movements in subtle acknowledgement, though no words were spoken. The inspector observed, too, that certain choir members lingered over particular phrases of music, their attention bordering on obsessive. He inferred that the attention was not purely artistic, rather, it was a vehicle for subtle commentary, a means of asserting vigilance over peers and maintaining an invisible ledger of minor errors. In Haverley, conformity to ritual often served as a vehicle for social dominance. Musical competence and moral propriety were inseparable, and both were meticulously monitored. As the rehearsal progressed, the soft murmur of the harmonies masked the faint undercurrent of whispered disapproval. Purbright, seated near the rear, allowed himself to enjoy the interplay of civility and judgment, the polite cough, the momentary glance, the half-smile that simultaneously conveyed encouragement and censure. Each was a small social signal, calibrated to maintain decorum while expressing quiet disapproval. Near the end of practice, a brief disturbance arose, a misplaced hymnal, left beneath a pew rather than in its prescribed folder. No one spoke directly, but subtle glances and microgestures were exchanged, conveying both recognition and reproach. Purbright noted that the error was minor, yet the collective attention it drew suggested latent tension among the choir, a network of observation and judgment more exacting than the music itself. As he prepared to depart, a subtle shift caught his attention. The assistant organist paused mid-note, fingers hovering over the keys, and glanced toward Miss Tripp with a fracti on of hesitation. It was an almost imperceptible act, yet in its slowness lay meaning, awareness, apprehension, and perhaps unspoken concern about observation. The chapter concluded not with revelation but with that quiet moment, a gesture that suggested the presence of scrutiny beyond the music, a minor clue that would unfold in due course. The choir filed out, polite yet slightly subdued, leaving behind the faint echo of harmonies and whispered judgment. Purbright lingered, eyes resting on the misaligned hymnal, the folded sheet music, and the brief hesitation of the organist. Haverley's mysteries did not announce themselves with drama. They emerged in these minor dislocations, these silent observations, these careful calibrations of behavior. And for the inspector, it was precisely here, amid the whispers and understated corrections, that the village's latent intrigues began to reveal their pattern. The vestry, ordinarily a place of quiet ritual and orderly storage, revealed an uncharacteristic disarray when Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after mid-morning. The pew cushions were displaced, the hymnals unevenly stacked, and one brass candle holder had been nudged from its accustomed position. Nothing violent had occurred, there were no broken panes, no overt signs of intrusion, but the very precision of the disorder suggested intentional disturbance rather than careless negligence. Purbright catalogued the irregularities with deliberate attention, noting how even minor deviations from habit could illuminate the workings of human intent. Miss Tripp greeted him at the door, her hands folded and her expression impeccably neutral. "I feared, Inspector, that some untoward curiosity had been exercised overnight," she said softly. Her phrasing implied no accusation, yet the subtle tension in her posture suggested anxiety, or perhaps culpability. Purbright observed the faint crease along her brow and the small tremor in her fingers as she gestured toward the displaced items. In Haverley, such minor physical hints often revealed more than any direct statement. The rector appeared behind her, adjusting his spectacles with deliberate care. "It is, I admit," he remarked in a tone both formal and concerned, "curious that nothing of value has been taken, and yet the arrangement of the vestry seems disturbed, perhaps the result of a routine oversight, though one cannot be certain." He spoke politely, as if weighing the delicate balance between acknowledgement and alarm. Purbright noted the almost imperceptible hesitation in his intonation. Even those accustomed to measured speech sometimes revealed minor truths in pauses and subtle shifts. Purbright moved through the room with quiet precision, examining each affected area. The displaced hymnals bore no fingerprints beyond the expected signs of handling, yet the positioning of the cushions and the subtle traces of dust suggested a careful, deliberate arrangement. The inspector reflected on the choreography of the possible observer, knowledge of the vestry's routine, awareness of entry and exit times, and sensitivity to what might attract attention or comment. The episode, though small, appeared calculated to test boundaries rather than to commit theft or overt disruption. The organist, who had arrived to deliver the afternoon sheet music, paused at the threshold, noticing the inspector and the minor disorder. His greeting was courteous but cautious. "I trust all is in order?" The question, formally phrased, carried the weight of unspoken evaluation. Purbright's attention rested not on the words but on the subtle arch of the organist's eyebrows and the way his fingers hovered over the music case, gestures that betrayed awareness of scrutiny and perhaps a fear of association with any empire. "Propriety." Miss Tripp offered the inspector tea in the adjoining room, her movements deliberate, polished, and almost ceremonious. Each gesture, the careful placement of the tray, the steady pour, the measured steps, suggested consciousness of observation and a desire to maintain impeccable propriety. Purbright accepted not out of thirst, but as a means of observing further. In villages such as Haverley, ritualized behavior often served as a social barometer, revealing anxiety, alliance, or subtle deception. The inspector's eyes returned to the vestry, cataloguing faint traces of movement, a slightly misaligned hymn board, a dust pattern on the pew suggesting a skirt brushed inadvertently, and the position of a small key on the sideboard, turned at a subtle angle. Each was minor, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they suggested presence and intention. Purbright made a mental note. Here, as elsewhere in Haverley, attention to detail was both a shield and a weapon. The smallest displacement could signify planning, surveillance, or deliberate signaling. A brief conversation with the rector highlighted the subtle tension of social expectation. Bellamy spoke of parishioners' concern regarding the vestry. "I have been assured that all are perturbed by what they might term disorder, though none would dare suggest impropriety outright." The inspector noted the careful hedging. In Haverley, moral censure was rarely direct. It travelled in whispers, glances, and half-phrases, leaving the accused to navigate invisible judgments. Purbright's observations extended to the subtle interaction between Miss Tripp and the organist. A glance exchanged over the ledger, almost imperceptible, carried a wealth of implications. Acknowledgement of oversight, recognition of observation, or perhaps unspoken complicity. The inspector recorded it mentally, aware that the social dynamics of Haverley often revealed themselves more fully in the language of gestures than in words. As the morning waned, Purbright prepared to leave, his final attention drawn to a small ink smudge at the edge of the ledger. It was slight, almost trivial, yet it suggested hurried writing or perhaps surreptitious notation. Such minor deviations, trivial to most, carried import in a community attuned to propriety. The vestry, orderly and ritualized by design, had become a locus for observation, a stage for subtle testing of boundaries and a repository of latent tension. The chapter concluded with Purbright's quiet awareness of one small deliberate anomaly. The candle, slightly tilted, reflected a presence aware of both routine and observation. No confession was offered. No accusation needed articulation. In Haverley, such small gestures whispered their meaning with precision, and the inspector, as always, listened carefully. Inspector Purbright arrived at the rectory shortly before the parish committee meeting, where the usual air of civility carried with it an undercurrent of cautious observation. The committee members were already assembling in the drawing room, each carefully seated in positions that subtly reflected social hierarchy. Miss Darling, with her habitual precision, presided at the head of the table, her hands folded lightly in front of her, the faintest crease between her brows suggesting both authority and anticipation. The room hummed with the soft rustle of skirts, the adjustment of spectacles, and the measured exchange of courteous greetings. "Inspector," said Miss Darling, inclining her head with exactness, "your presence is appreciated. I trust your examination of parish matters has been productive." The qualifier, deliberate and polite, implied both inquiry and expectation. Purbright offered a gentle nod, noting the subtle inflection of her voice, and "Jitch." Brief glance she cast toward the rector. In Haverley, civility rarely existed without an accompanying layer of scrutiny. The rector, Mr. Bellamy, interjected with careful phrasing, "I am certain the inspector's observations will assist us in preserving our customary harmony, though we must remain mindful of propriety and discretion." His choice of words, courteous yet measured, hinted at awareness of latent tensions among committee members. Purbright recorded both tone and gesture with quiet attention, the slight lift of an eyebrow, the brief straightening of the shoulders, each gesture a potential signal. Discussion commenced with the usual topics: financial allocations, scheduling of services, and organization of social functions, but beneath the surface, every comment was laden with subtext. Mr. Finch, polishing his spectacles, commented on minor discrepancies in last month's charitable accounting. His words were carefully hedged, polite, indirect, yet carrying a subtle suggestion of vigilance, a gentle reminder of oversight. Purbright observed the committee's reactions, tight smiles, fleeting nods, and the soft rustle of papers, all masking internal judgments. Miss Tripp, standing discreetly near the window with her notebook in hand, displayed a precise neutrality, yet her eyes flickered toward particular members when financial matters were discussed. The inspector noted the movement, a slight shift of weight, the barely perceptible tightening of the jaw, a hand brushing the notebook as if to conceal hesitation. In Haverley, such gestures were rarely accidental. They functioned as minor instruments of signaling, acknowledgement, or restrained critique. The conversation turned to the recent vestry disturbance. Miss Darling's voice, steady and formal, recounted the displacement of cushions and hymnals, framing it as a matter of decorum rather than potential mischief. Each member nodded with polite attention, yet their glances betrayed subtle disagreement or recognition of the social implications. Purbright catalogued the almost imperceptible cues, a hand lightly touching a ledger, a foot tapping in measured rhythm, the faint arching of eyebrows in silent appraisal. At one point the rector referred to the bundle of lavender-scented letters recently discovered. "Some correspondence," he said carefully, "arrives with the best of intentions, yet may inadvertently raise concern." The phrasing was delicate, deliberate. Purbright noted that the term inadvertently functioned as a protective shield for implied scrutiny. The letters had become instruments of observation, their scent a signal, their careful wording a vehicle for subtle influence. Committee members shifted in their seats, as if sensing the implicit acknowledgement of scrutiny. Miss Darling steered the discussion toward social obligations, emphasizing decorum, moral duty, and proper attention to detail. Each member offered examples of compliance, often over-explaining minor achievements with the faintest hint of self-justification. Purbright observed the underlying motivations: reassurance of reputation, avoidance of perceived censure, and the gentle establishment of social hierarchy. It was a dance of civility, carefully choreographed, yet revealing more than overt speech could convey. Toward the conclusion of the meeting, Purbright's attention rested upon the subtle interaction between Miss Tripp and Mr. Finch. Their eyes met briefly over the ledger, a flicker of recognition, perhaps acknowledgement of minor oversight, or a quiet exchange of unspoken information. The moment passed almost unnoticed by the others, yet it suggested the presence of collusion, or at least shared awareness of irregularities. As the committee rose to depart, the inspector noted a small, deliberate anomaly. The ledger, slightly ajar on the edge of the table, bore a faint indentation along the margin. It suggested hurried or concealed notation, trivial to the casual observer, yet significant within Haverley's meticulous social lattice. Purbright filed the detail mentally, aware that such minor deviations often presaged more substantial revelations. The chapter closed on a quiet shift of atmosphere. Chairs scraped softly, skirts rustled, and glances were exchanged, each a measured acknowledgement of unspoken observation. No accusations were voiced, no one breached civility, yet beneath the formal politeness, reputations were observed, alliances subtly reinforced, and anxieties delicately sown. Purbright, accustomed to such nuanced readings, understood that the next stage of the parish's social drama would emerge precisely from these understated gestures, the faintest hints of movement, and the quietly persistent attention to minor irregularities. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the rectory study, illuminating the delicate lavender scent that lingered faintly in the air. Inspector Purbright moved with deliberate quiet, noting the minor details that often betrayed intention, the slight smudge along the margin of the ledger, the subtle tilt of a chair, the faint impression of fingerprints on the polished tabletop. The letters, neatly stacked yet slightly ajar, seemed almost to hum with latent significance. In Haverley, correspondence was never wholly innocuous. It bore the weight of observation, judgment, and the quiet exercise of influence. Miss Tripp entered with her habitual calm, yet the faint crease of her brow hinted at unease. "Inspector," she said softly, placing a tray of tea on the desk, "I thought it prudent you might wish to examine these further." Her voice, impeccably measured, suggested courtesy, vigilance, and a hint of anxiety. Purbright observed her carefully, the precise placement of the tray, the controlled folding of her hands, the slight hesitation before she retreated to the doorway. Even the smallest gestures, he reflected, could reveal awareness of knowledge, or perhaps complicity. The rector appeared, adjusting his spectacles with careful deliberation. "I confess, Inspector," he remarked, "that the letter's presence has caused mild perturbation. Nothing overtly alarming, yet sufficient to unsettle the habitual equilibrium of the parish." His phrasing was precise, courteous, and lightly hedged, reflecting both concern and the subtle art of understatement. Purbright noted the inflection, the almost imperceptible tension in the tilt of the head, the careful choice of words. Haverley's civility was never neutral. It carried meaning beneath the surface. The inspector began to examine the correspondence. The handwriting was meticulous, each letter scored with polite, precise loops, yet the spacing and rhythm betrayed a mind attuned to observation. The content was equally measured, notes of minor concern regarding vestry order, committee diligence, and adherence to proper decorum. Each phrase, though courteous, carried an undertone of surveillance. Purbright observed that the letters functioned as instruments of social calibration, intended to test responses, signal oversight, or subtly assert influence. Miss Tripp lingered near the window, her eyes drawn to the slight variations in handwriting. Some, she remarked softly, arrived in the morning, placed under the mat, while others were delivered directly to the office. "It is peculiar, though I presume the intention was discretion." The qualifier suggested her awareness of intentionality, yet her phrasing preserved decorum. Purbright noted the careful selection of words. Peculiar hinted at subtle curiosity or judgment, presume indicated caution in speech. Every choice carried significance. The rector joined her at the window, observing the streets below, as if the movement of passers-by might provide insight. "I have instructed the committees to report any unusual deliveries," he said, "though one hopes such vigilance does not itself become a source of rumor." His tone was courteous, yet layered with meaning, recognition of social anxiety, acknowledgement of observation, and the ever-present concern for reputation. Purbright catalogued the interaction, gestures, pauses, and careful word choice, each a thread in the fabric of parish oversight. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of Mrs. Abernathy, carrying a bundle of newsletters. She greeted the inspector with perfect composure, yet her eyes flickered briefly toward the letters. "I thought you might find these of interest," she said, placing the papers neatly on the desk. Her wording, polite yet deliberate, suggested subtle participation in the pattern of observation. Purbright noted the careful way she aligned the bundle with the letters, as if establishing hierarchy, emphasizing attention to both order and social signal. The inspector's gaze returned to the letters. One envelope bore a faint indentation at its lower margin, suggesting hurried notation or concealed marking. Another had a slightly uneven fold, as if handled quickly or under mild anxiety. Trivial to an unobservant eye, yet within the context of Haverley, these minor deviations indicated the presence of deliberate, watchful hands. Purbright considered the patterns, the sequence of delivery, and the subtle social choreography at work. Each letter a probe, each gesture a test, each phrase a calibrated exercise in influence. As he prepared to leave, Purbright observed a subtle shift in behavior. Miss Tripp's fingers lingered near the envelope with the uneven fold. Mrs. Abernathy's gaze followed the inspector, then briefly darted toward the rector, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement. The rector, in turn, straightened slightly, eyes lingering on the ink smudge at the edge of the ledger. The chapter concluded on this quiet note of potential recognition, the first hint of coordinatio. N. Awareness, or deliberate manipulation among parishioners, silent and polite, yet pregnant with implication. The letters, lavender-scented and meticulous, were no longer mere correspondence. They were instruments of social calibration, subtle probes in the quiet machinery of Haverley's morality and reputation. And as Purbright stepped into the soft late-afternoon light, he carried with him the knowledge that observation alone, careful, patient, and unobtrusive, would unravel the latent intrigues of the parish, one delicate clue at a time. The parish tea was held, as tradition demanded, in the long room overlooking the churchyard, where lace curtains softened both the light and the scrutiny of those within. Inspector Purbright arrived neither early nor late, a punctuality that passed unnoticed yet was quietly registered by several present. Chairs were arranged with polite symmetry, and the teapot occupied its customary position at the center of the table. Like an unspoken authority, no one cared to challenge. Conversation proceeded in low, careful tones, as though the walls themselves might be recording lapses in decorum. Mrs. Abernathy presided over the pouring with measured efficiency. "Milk first or after?" she inquired, though the question was less about preference than observation. Purbright replied neutrally, noting how several eyes flickered toward his cup before returning, with relief, to their sources. In Haverley, even such minor choices were read for character. The inspector reflected, not without dry amusement, that the village seemed to maintain a moral register of tea habits. Miss Darling spoke at length on the success of the recent charitable appeal, her phrasing immaculate and her smile carefully moderated. She praised collective effort while subtly reinforcing her own administrative diligence. Mr. Finch responded with courteous affirmation, though his fingers tapped the teacup once too often, betraying impatience masked as attentiveness. Purbright observed this exchange with interest. Praise, he noted, was rarely offered without calculation, and rarely received without internal qualification. Miss Tripp arrived slightly after the others, apologizing with precision and taking her seat near the window. Her presence altered the room's equilibrium in a manner too subtle to define yet immediately perceptible. Conversation faltered momentarily, then resumed with increased politeness. Purbright registered the shift. Her role within the parish, neither fully authoritative nor entirely peripheral, placed her in a position of quiet influence, one that invited scrutiny without conferring immunity. The discussion drifted, as it often did, toward minor inconveniences, a delayed newsletter, a misunderstood notice. The vestry's recent disorder was mentioned obliquely, framed as a question of routine rather than intrusion. "One dislikes speculation," Mrs. Abernathy remarked, her tone suggesting she had already indulged in it privately. Heads nodded in gentle agreement. Purbright noticed that no one asked who had first discovered the disturbance. Silence, in this case, functioned as consensus. Tea was replenished. Biscuits circulated. A sense of shared vigilance settled over the group, not oppressive but carefully sustained. Purbright listened more than he spoke, content to observe the interplay of civility and evasion. Each participant appeared to be both audience and performer, measuring words not for truth but for safety. The inspector reflected that the parish's moral life was conducted less through principle than through alignment. At one point, Miss Tripp excused herself to fetch additional napkins. As she rose, her chair brushed lightly against the sideboard, producing a sound just loud enough to draw attention. It was an accident, undoubtedly. Yet several glances followed her movement, lingering a fraction too long. When she returned, her expression was unchanged, but Purbright noted the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. Awareness, he suspected, had become reciprocal. The rector entered late, offering apologies that were accepted with practiced grace. He spoke briefly of Sunday's sermon, touching upon vigilance, stewardship, and the dangers of misplaced concern. His words were well chosen, their implications diffuse enough to offend no one directly. Still, Purbright observed that several listeners sat more upright, as though recognizing themselves in the abstract. Moral instruction, he reflected, was safest when impersonal. As the gathering drew toward its close, Purbright's attention was caught by a minor irregularity. Mrs. Abernathy's copy of the Parish Register lay open beside her teacup, its page marked not with the usual ribbon, but with a folded envelope corner, lavender scented. She noticed his glance and closed the book smoothly, her smile unchanged. "Old habits," she said lightly. "One is always misplacing bookmarks." Purbright inclined his head, accepting the explanation without comment. Yet the gesture lingered in his thoughts. The envelope corner was not merely a placeholder, it was deliberate, chosen. A reminder, perhaps, or a signal. He considered the pattern now emerging, not dramatic, not overt, but unmistakable in its accumulation. Letters, observations, minor disturbances, careful conversations, all pointed toward a shared enterprise of quiet monitoring. The tea concluded with polite farewells and assurances of continued cooperation. Chairs were returned to position, cups aligned, reputations, for the moment, restored to equilibrium. Purbright lingered briefly, watching as Mrs. Abernathy tucked the register under her arm and exchanged a glance with Miss Dorling. Brief, composed, and entirely unremarkable to anyone not looking for it. As he stepped into the cool afternoon air, the inspector reflected that the parish had begun, quite unconsciously, to reveal its structure of attention. Not who had acted precisely, but who had noticed, and who wished to be seen as noticing. The distinction, he suspected, would soon prove instructive. The chapter ended not with certainty, but with alignment, a sense that observation itself had become the village's quiet occupation, and that somewhere within that shared vigilance lay the answer Purbright sought. Inspector Purbright requested that the principal parish figures attend a final meeting in the rectory drawing room, a request framed as clarification rather than confrontation. The invitation, delivered with polite neutrality, was accepted by all with expressions of mild curiosity and carefully concealed concern. Chairs were arranged in a modest semicircle, the tea tray present but untouched, as if refreshment might trivialize the purpose of the gathering. The atmosphere was neither tense nor relaxed. It occupied the more familiar parish register of restrained anticipation. Miss Darling arrived first, composed and attentive, followed by Mrs. Abernathy, who placed her handbag at her feet with deliberate precision. Mr. Finch entered next, nodding courteously to each, his spectacles polished to a reflective sheen. Miss Tripp arrived last, apologizing softly, her tone exact and her posture immaculate. The rector joined them moments later, offering a few measured remarks on the value of clarity and mutual understanding. No one contradicted him. Purbright remained standing for a moment, surveying the group with mild interest. "I appreciate your attendance," he began, his voice even and unhurried. "My intention is not to attribute blame, but to address a pattern that has emerged." The word pattern settled gently into the room, neither accusatory nor reassuring. Several listeners inclined their heads, acknowledging its presence without claiming recognition. He spoke of letters, anonymous, courteous, observant, of minor disturbances that invited comment rather than concern, of committees alert to deviations so small they required explanation rather than correction. Each element was presented as an observation rather than an allegation. As Purbright spoke, he noted reactions: Miss Darling's faint tightening of the mouth, Mrs. Abernathy's stillness, Mr. Finch's hands folded with excessive neatness. Miss Tripp listened intently, her gaze lowered, her expression unreadable. The letters, Purbright continued, were not written with malice, nor were the disturbances acts of vandalism. They were gestures, calculated, restrained, intended to observe response. He paused, allowing the implication to settle. In short, this parish has been watching itself. No one objected. Silence, in this context, functioned as acknowledgement. Mrs. Abernathy spoke at last. "One becomes concerned," she said carefully, "when standards ap. Ear to shift. Attention, I believe, is a form of care." Her phrasing was precise, her tone untroubled. Miss Dorling nodded slightly, as if the sentiment aligned with her own. Purbright inclined his head, accepting the statement without endorsement. "Care," he replied, "can become scrutiny, and scrutiny, when shared without clarity, often leads to anxiety." He allowed himself the faintest hint of dry amusement, particularly in communities that prize decorum. The rector cleared his throat. "I fear," he said gently, "that we may have mistaken vigilance for virtue." His words were met with polite stillness. No one contradicted him, though several appeared to consider the distinction anew. Purbright turned his attention to Miss Tripp. "You facilitated the letters," he said, not as accusation but as statement. She met his gaze calmly. "Yes," she replied, "at the request of others. I believe discretion preferable to rumor." Her honesty was quiet, her manner undefensive. Mrs. Abernathy shifted slightly, then stilled. Miss Dolling's expression remained composed. The intention, Miss Tripp added, was never harm, only awareness. The word echoed faintly in the room. Purbright nodded. And yet awareness, once introduced, rarely remains neutral. He gestured lightly toward the ledger on the side table. "The parish has become attentive to itself in ways that are no longer entirely benign." No one spoke. The observation required no response. The meeting concluded without formal resolution. No apologies were demanded, no confessions elicited. The letters would cease. The vestry would be restored. Committees would resume their work with renewed, if quieter, diligence. Reputations, though lightly scuffed, would remain intact. As each participant departed, courtesy was observed with renewed care, as though civility itself had been briefly placed under inspection. Purbright lingered after they had gone, standing alone in the drawing-room. The tea had gone cold. He noticed that the ledger had been straightened, its pages aligned with unnecessary precision. Someone, he suspected, had done so deliberately. As he stepped outside, the church bells began to ring the hour, clear, measured, and familiar. The sound carried across the village with reassuring regularity. Yet Purbright reflected that something had shifted. Not behavior, perhaps, but awareness of behavior. The parish would continue much as before, but with a new restraint, observation tempered by memory. He walked on, satisfied not by resolution, but by equilibrium restored. The mystery, such as it was, had not involved crime, but conscience. And in Haverley, that was quite enough.